May 25, 1945. 24,000 feet above the Bungo Strait, south of the Japanese home islands. The air inside the cockpit is thin and frigid, vibrating with the guttural roar of a 2,000-horsepower Homare radial engine. Warrant Officer Kenjiro Sato adjusts his oxygen mask, his eyes scanning the dazzling blue void above the Pacific. Below him, the Bungo Strait is a sheet of hammered bronze under the morning sun. But Sato isn't looking at the scenery. He is looking for the glint of silver. He is flying the Nakajima Ki84 Hayate, codenamed Frank by the Allies. It is the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. It is sleek, heavily armed with 20mm cannons, and fast enough to run down a Mustang. For months, Sato and his squadron mates have been told that this machine is the equalizer. It is the sword that will sever the American bomber streams strangling their homeland. Then he sees them. 12 specks at 2 o'clock high. They aren't the B-29 superfortresses that usually lumber toward Tokyo. They are fighters, but they look wrong. They are grotesque. To Sato's trained eye, accustomed to the delicate, predatory lines of the Zero or the Oscar, these American planes look like flying milk bottles. They are thick-bodied, heavy, and ungainly. They are Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. The Jug. A crackle of static hisses through Sato's headset. His flight leader's voice is laced with contempt. Ignore the fat ones. They cannot turn. They cannot climb. Dive through them and find the bombers. The Japanese formation, confident in the superior agility of their Franks, tips their wings and rolls into an attack vector. They have read the intelligence reports. They believe the P-47 is a low-altitude ground pounder, a sluggish beast that bleeds energy in a turn and falls out of the sky if you push it too hard. They believe they are about to slaughter a herd of clumsy oxen. Sato pushes his throttle forward, the Ki-84 surging as he picks out a straggler on the edge of the American formation. The silhouette of the enemy plane grows larger. It's immense. It looks less like an aircraft and more like a locomotive with wings. Sato grins behind his mask. He anticipates the American pilot will panic, try to turn, and stall out, offering a stationary target for his cannons. But the American doesn't turn. As Sato closes the distance, the fat American fighter suddenly snaps inverted. It doesn't roll with the lethargy of a bomber. It rolls with a violence that defies physics. The sunlight catches the teardrop-shaped bubble canopy, a shimmering glass dome offering the pilot perfect 360-degree visibility. Before Sato can adjust his aim, the P-47 dives. It doesn't just descend, it vanishes. The acceleration is instantaneous. The massive four-bladed paddle propeller bites into the dense air. The pilot yanks back on the stick. The Jug screams upward in a zoom climb, trading that massive speed for altitude, rocketing back up toward the fight like a pendulum swinging back for a killing blow. Sato checks his six, sweat stinging his eyes. The sky is suddenly filled with tracers. The clumsy ox is back, and it has brought friends. The distinct, terrifying sound of 8 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns erupts, the sound like heavy canvas ripping apart. A Ki-84 to Sato's left disintegrates. It doesn't smoke, it simply ceases to be an airplane. The convergence of 8 streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds saws the Japanese fighter's wing off at the root. The fuselage tumbles away, engulfed in a ball of orange flame. Sato yanks his stick hard right, banking into a tight turn, the maneuver that has saved Japanese pilots for 4 years. Turn inside them, he thinks. Make them fight our war.
June 1945. 0430 hours.
Ishima Airfield, Ryukyu Islands. The dawn has not yet broken, but the humidity is already a physical weight, pressing down on the coral airstrips of Ishima. The air smells of crushed limestone, salt spray, and the pungent chemical sting of high-octane aviation fuel. Shadowy figures move across the flight line of the 318th Fighter Group. These are the pioneers of the Very Long-Range Mission. They look less like knights of the air and more like deep-sea divers preparing for a descent. They are layered in flight suits, Mae West life vests, parachutes, survival kits, pistols, knives, and maps. Walking to his aircraft, a pilot in the 318th isn't just worried about the enemy, he is worried about the physics of takeoff. Parked in the revetments, the P-47Ns sit low on their landing gear, their tires bulging under the strain. Fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, a P-47N weighs over 20,000 pounds. To put that in perspective, that is heavier than a German Do-17 bomber from the Battle of Britain. And yet this is a single-engine fighter expected to drag that mass into the sky. Clear prop! The cry echoes down the line, followed by the coughing sputter and then the thunderous catch of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800s. One by one, the giant four-bladed paddle propellers blur into invisible discs of violence. The takeoff run is a harrowing ordeal. The pilots hold the brakes, revving the engines until the airframes shake violently, threatening to tear themselves apart. When the brakes are released, the jugs don't leap, they lumber. They gather speed agonizingly slowly. The end of the runway rushes closer, a cliff edge dropping off into the ocean. Dust kicks up in blinding sheets. At the very last second, with feet of runway remaining, the heavy fighters claw their way into the air, wallowing just above the waves as the landing gear retracts. They are flying tanks, struggling for lift. But once they burn off the first 100 gallons of fuel and gain altitude, the beast transforms. The formation creates a massive V-shape in the sky, pointing north. Now begins the second enemy of the Pacific War, the grind. The flight to the Japanese mainland is not a quick hop. It is a 3 to 4 hour commute one way. For the pilots, this is a test of physical endurance that borders on torture. They are strapped into a metal bucket seat, unable to move their legs more than a few inches. The vibration of the engine travels up through the spine, numbing the lower back. There is no autopilot. The pilot must constantly fly the plane, adjusting trim, monitoring oil pressure, manifold pressure, and fuel mixture. They have to manage their gas consumption with the obsession of a miser, switching between fuselage tanks and wing tanks, balancing the aircraft's center of gravity. And then there are the basic human needs. Relieving oneself in a P-47 at 20,000 feet involves a relief tube, a small funnel and hose that frequently freezes up in the sub-zero temperatures of high altitude, leading to a mess that is both humiliating and uncomfortable. Hour after hour, the blue ocean rolls by beneath them. The drone of the engine becomes hypnotic. Fatigue sets in. It is easy to drift off, to let the eyes lose focus. But falling asleep here means drifting out of formation and disappearing into the vastness of the Pacific, never to be seen again. The radio chatter is kept to a minimum. "Check your oxygen," a flight leader might say, the only break in the static. Then the horizon changes. The endless blue breaks against the jagged green and brown coast of Kyushu. The adrenaline spike is immediate. The fatigue vanishes, replaced by a razor-sharp tension. The pilots sit up straighter, checking their gun sights, arming their weapons switches. They are entering the Empire. This is the moment the P-47N was built for. They have traveled 800 miles to pick a fight. The external drop tanks are dry. The pilots flip the release switches. Thunk, thunk. Hundreds of aluminum tanks tumble away from the formation, flashing in the sun as they fall toward the Japanese countryside. The P-47Ns, suddenly thousands of pounds lighter, seem to leap forward. The heavy bombers they are escorting, the B-29s, are ahead, tiny silver crosses against the dark terrain. And rising to meet them are the black specks of the defense, the Ki84 Franks, the N1K Georges, the desperate aces of the Imperial Army and Navy. They see the B-29s and think they have a chance. They see the single-engine fighters and assume they're tired, low on fuel, and far from home. They are about to discover that the fat Americans are fresh, full of fight, and piloted by men who have traveled across an ocean just to kill them. The air inside the B-17 Flying Fortress was frigid, a sharp, metallic cold that seeped through the electrically heated suits of the crew. Outside, the world was a brilliant, hostile blue. Flak bursts peppered the sky, dirty black smudges that jolted the massive bomber with concussive fists. Lieutenant James Jimmy Stewart, no relation to the famous actor, gripped the controls, his knuckles white. He was a long way from the wheat fields of Kansas. His eyes, constantly scanning the instrument panel, then the endless sky, were drawn to the contrails, dozens of them, a sprawling highway of white chalk lines pointing towards the heart of the Reich. It was the largest armada of bombers ever assembled, a testament to American industrial might. "Fighters! 9 o'clock high!" The tail gunner's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with panic. Jimmy craned his neck. Silhouetted against the sun, they looked like a swarm of angry hornets. Not the stubby Messerschmitt Bf-109s they were used to, but something new, something faster. Focke-Wulf FW-190s. They fell on the formation with a terrifying velocity, their wings sparkling as their 20-millimeter cannons fired. The sound was not a rattle, but a series of deep, percussive thumps against the fuselage. To Jimmy's left, a B-17 named Memphis Belle took a direct hit in the wing root. There was no graceful descent, only a violent orange and black detonation that tore the aircraft into 1,000 spinning fragments. No parachutes. This was the reality of fighting Nazi Germany. It was a war of technological terror, of screaming Stukas, of thunderous panzer divisions, and of sleek, deadly interceptors. For the men in those bombers, and for the world watching, the Third Reich projected an image of unstoppable modern power. Its war machine seemed a quantum leap beyond anything that had come before. Yet, as Jimmy Stewart wrestled his fortress towards its target, a ball-bearing factory in Schweinfurt, he was participating in a systematic dismantling of a fundamental weakness. The very fact that he was here, deep in German airspace, in broad daylight, was proof of a fatal flaw. This colossus, for all its terrifying innovations, was built on feet of clay. It could deliver a devastating first blow, but it lacked the deep, resilient strength of its predecessor, the very empire it claimed to supersede. Imperial Germany had fought the world to a bloody stalemate for 4 long years. The Nazi war machine, for all its bluster and blitzkrieg, would be broken in just over half that time. The question wasn't about how hard it could punch, but how long it could stay on its feet. The bombs from Jimmy Stewart's B-17 fell towards the factories in Schweinfurt, but the true crisis for Nazi Germany was not just in its factories, it was in what powered them and moved its armies. To understand that, we must leave the freezing skies over Germany and travel east to the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Soviet Union. December 29, 1942. Outside Veliki Luki, Russia. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter slammed the hatch of his Panzer IV shut, the metallic clang a final grim note in the symphony of chaos outside. The temperature was 30 below zero. Inside the tank, it was barely any warmer. The engine, a Maybach HL-120 that had purred on the roads of France, now groaned and wheezed, its oil as thick as tar. Through his vision slit, he saw a landscape of white despair. The advance had stalled not because of Soviet T-34s, but because of the cold and a crippling lack of fuel. His company was down to 5 operational tanks. The others were silent, frozen hulks dotting the snowfield like metal graves, their fuel tanks siphoned dry days ago. "We wait for the supply trucks," the company commander's voice crackled over the radio, weak and laced with static. "Conserve what you have." Conserve what? Klaus thought bitterly. They had been stationary for 48 hours, engines run for only 10-minute intervals to prevent them from seizing solid. The infantry, huddled in shallow pits scraped from the frozen earth, were in worse shape. This was not war, it was a slow frozen siege by the land itself, and it all traced back to a single, irreplaceable resource: oil. This was the second critical weakness, the lifeblood that Imperial Germany had in relative abundance, but upon which the Nazi war machine was perpetually starving. The Kaiser's Germany, while not self-sufficient in oil, fought a war within its continent. Its primary fuel was coal, of which it had mountains. Its armies were supplied by a vast and efficient railway network, running on that same coal. Its navy, though formidable, was designed for North Sea operations. The economy and military were built around accessible, domestic resources. The Nazi war machine, by contrast, was built on the internal combustion engine. The Blitzkrieg was a doctrine of gasoline. The panzer divisions, the Stuka dive bombers, the trucks that moved the infantry and supplies, they all gulped down thousands of tons of fuel that Germany simply did not possess. Hitler's entire strategy was a desperate gamble to capture the resources he lacked. The push into the Caucasus in 1942 was not just a military maneuver, it was a lifeline thrown toward the oil fields of Maikop and Grozny. It failed. By 1944, the situation was catastrophic. Despite controlling almost all of continental Europe, German oil production was a fraction of the Allies. The synthetic fuel plants, like the one at Leuna, became the most bombed-out targets in Europe. Meanwhile, the United States was producing over 80% of the world's oil. The Soviet Union, with its vast fields in Baku, could absorb staggering losses and keep fighting. The German army, for all its tactical brilliance, was slowly grinding to a halt. A Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering, but without fuel, it was just a 60-ton pillbox. The mighty Imperial German army had been beaten in the field. The Nazi Wehrmacht was, in many ways, asphyxiated before it was ever defeated. The faint, desperate radio signal from Unteroffizier Richter's frozen Panzer IV in Russia was a symptom of a disease that ran much deeper than a single failed offensive. It was a disease rooted in the very economic soul of the Third Reich. To understand it, we must pull back from the Eastern Front and dive into the ledgers, into the twisted economic philosophy that made Nazi Germany so spectacularly unstable compared to its predecessor. This was the third and perhaps most fatal weakness, the economic foundation. Imperial Germany in 1914 was an economic powerhouse fully integrated, albeit competitively, into the global economy. It was the world's second-largest exporter, a nation of trade and industry. It had vast gold reserves and a stable, respected currency. When war came, it could leverage this immense financial strength to purchase what it needed from neutrals like the Netherlands and Sweden. It had the credit and the economic credibility to sustain a long conflict. Nazi Germany, by contrast, was an economic pariah from the start. Hitler's regime was built on a foundation of debt and plunder. The MIFO bills, a complex scheme of promissory notes, had hidden massive rearmament spending in the 1930s, creating a ticking time bomb of inflation. They had looted the gold reserves of annexed nations, but this was one-time spoils, not sustainable income. Most critically, their policy of autarky, economic self-sufficiency, was a failure. They lacked the colonies and the global trade relationships that the Kaiser had enjoyed. The Nazi economy was not a diversified, organic system. It was a machine designed for aggression, fueled by theft. It was like a shark that had to keep moving, keep conquering to survive. Once the Blitzkrieg stalled against the Soviet Union and the full weight of the American economy entered the war, the game was up. The Reichsmark was worthless on international markets. They had no credit. They could only trade by barter or threat. The mighty Krupp works, which had armed the Kaiser's armies with a seemingly endless supply of artillery, now found itself rationing alloy metals, its production lines halted for lack of a single, obscure component stuck on a neutral ship in a blockaded port. Imperial Germany fought a world war with the resources of a global economic power. Nazi Germany tried to fight one with the resources of a single, overstretched continent. It was a battle between a deep, wide reservoir and a shallow, leaking bucket. June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. Gefreiter Emil Vogel, a boy of 19 from Dresden, stared out from his concrete bunker, the Widerstandsnest, into a sight that defied comprehension. The gray horizon of the English Channel had been blotted out by ships, thousands of them. Landing craft churned the water into a froth, disgorging a seemingly endless tide of men and machines onto the sand. The air vibrated with a constant deafening roar. The deep thunder of naval guns, the higher-pitched scream of fighter bombers, and the relentless crackle of small arms fire. He squeezed the trigger of his MG-42, the weapon chattering, its belt feeding through his hands. For every landing craft he saw swerve away, two more took its place. He was not fighting an army, he was fighting a tidal wave of production. This scene on the Normandy coast was the inevitable conclusion to the story written in the skies over Schweinfurt, the frozen fields of Veliky Luki, and the blockaded port of Wilhelmshaven. The Allies were not just landing on the beaches of France, they were unleashing the accumulated, overwhelming weight of economic and industrial power that the Third Reich simply could not match. The question was no longer if Germany would lose, but how swiftly the end would come. And here lies the final stark contrast between the two Germanys. In November 1918, Imperial Germany surrendered. Its army, the Kaiserheer, was battered and retreating, but it was still a coherent force, fighting on foreign soil. The home front was starving, but it had not collapsed into total chaos. The surrender was a political and military decision to avoid a futile final battle on German soil. There was a structure, a chain of command, a semblance of order, even in defeat. The collapse of Nazi Germany was of a different, more apocalyptic nature. By the spring of 1945, the nation was a carcass being torn apart. The Western Allies and the Soviets met at the Elbe, having sliced the Reich in two. Cities were rubble. Transportation was non-existent. What little industry remained was underground or in ruins. The regime, in its final psychotic throes, turned on its own people, with SS hangmen dangling deserters from lampposts, while party officials fled with stolen loot. There was no orderly surrender. It was a total systemic failure, economic, military, and moral. The Blitzkrieg had been designed to avoid the static, grinding warfare of 1914 to 1918. In the end, it produced a far more rapid and total collapse. Imperial Germany's deep strength allowed it to endure for 4 years and negotiate an armistice. Nazi Germany's shallow brittle cower allowed it to shine with terrifying brilliance for 2 years, but it shattered completely in the third. It was not built for the long haul. It was a machine that ran on plunder and momentum, and when the momentum stopped, the machine seized, exploded, and consumed itself. The Third Reich did not just lose a war, it disintegrated under the weight of its own unsustainable design.
क्या आपने कभी महसूस किया है कि दिन खत्म होने से पहले ही आपकी तवानाई खत्म हो जाती है? वो जोश, वो चमक, वो तवानाई जो कभी आपकी पहचान हुआ करती थी, वो कहाँ गुम हो गई? दिन भर का काम, जिम्मेदारियां और तनाव, ये सब मिलकर आपके अंदर की रोशनी को मांद कर देते हैं। लेकिन यकीन जानिए, ये रोशनी कभी बुझती नहीं, सिर्फ धीमी पड़ जाती है। और इसे फिर से रोशन करने का राज छुपा है कुदरत के इस खूबसूरत तोहफे में, जो ना सिर्फ आपको अंदर से मजबूत बनाएगा, बल्कि हर रात आपको एक नई सुबह जैसा एहसास दिलाएगा। सच तो ये है कि हमारा जिस्म और कुदरत का रिश्ता बहुत गहरा है। जब हम इस रिश्ते को नज़रअंदाज कर देते हैं तो तवानाई में कमी, सुस्ती और बेचैनी हमारा मुकद्दर बन जाती है। हमारे बुजुर्ग इस राज को जानते थे। वही वो नुस्खे, वही जड़ी बूटियां जो सर्दियों की रातों में हमारे घरों में खुशबू और तवानाई बिखेरा करती थी। और आज साइंस भी इस बात की तस्दीक करती है कि ये कुदरती अज्जा न सिर्फ हमारे मुदाफ़ियती निज़ाम को मजबूत बनाते हैं, बल्कि हमारे हार्मोन्स को मुतवाज़न रखते हुए तवानाई के बहरान को ख़त्म करते हैं। तो आइए आज ही सफ़र का आगाज़ करें। अपने आप से एक वादा करें कि आप अपनी सेहत को सबसे पहली तरजीह देंगे। मैं आपको वो सादा पुराने वक्तों के आजमूदा नुस्खे दिखाने वाली हूँ जो आपके खून के बहाव को तेज़ करेंगे, आपके निज़ाम इन्हज़ाम को दुरुस्त करेंगे और आपकी नींद को गहरा और पुरसुकून बनाएंगे। पहला नुस्खा, सुबह की ताजगी का जादू। मौसम सरमा की चाय। ये चाय ना सिर्फ आपके दिन की शुरुआत तवानाई से भरपूर करेगी, बल्कि आपके जिस्म को अंदर से गर्म रखेगी। अज्जा है अदरक का एक थोड़ा सा टुकड़ा ताज़ा, लौंग के 2 दाने, इलायची के 2 दाने, शहद 1 चम्मच हस्बे जायका, पानी 1 कप। बनाने का तरीका है अदरक, लौंग और इलायची को हल्का सा कूट लें। 1 कप पानी में उन्हें डालकर तकरीबन 5 मिनट तक उबालें, फिर छानकर थोड़ा ठंडा होने दें, फिर शहद मिला लें। याद रहे, गर्म पानी में शहद डालने से इसके फ़ायदेमंद एंजाइम्स ख़त्म हो जाते हैं। इस्तेमाल और फ़वाइद हैं। इस चाय को सुबह निहार मुँह पिएं। ये जिस्म में गर्मी पैदा करेगी, खून साफ करेगी, निज़ाम इन्हिज़ाम दुरुस्त करेगी और आपको दिन भर चुस्त रखेगी। दूसरा नुस्खा, रात का सुकून, गहरी नींद का तोहफा, ताकत का दूध। सोने से पहले ये दूध पीना आपकी नींद के मयार में हैरत अंगेज तब्दीली ले आएगा। अज्जा है दूध 1 गिलास, खालिस ले लें इसको। खजूर यानी कि छुआरा 2 अदद, गुठली निकालकर बारीक काट लें। खुश्क नारियल 1 चाय का चम्मच, बारीक कटा हुआ। अदरक का रस ले लें आधा चाय का चम्मच। बनाने का तरीका है, दूध को हल्की आंच पर गर्म करें, इसमें कटी हुई खजूर, नारियल और अदरक का रस डालकर 4-5 मिनट तक हल्की आंच पर पकाएं। गरम गरम पी लें। इस्तेमाल और फ़वाइद हैं, रात को सोने से तकरीबन 45 मिनट पहले इस दूध का इस्तेमाल करें। ये ना सिर्फ आपके पट्ठों और जोड़ों के दर्द को आराम पहुंचाता है, बल्कि एहसास को पुरसुकून करके गहरी और मायारी नींद लाता है। दोस्तों, ये सिर्फ मशरूबात नहीं है, ये आपकी अपनी ज़ात के लिए मोहब्बत का इजहार है। इन्हें अपनी रोज़मर्रा की आदतों का हिस्सा बनाएं और 3 से 4 दिनों के अंदर ही फ़र्क महसूस करें। आपकी आंखों में चमक, चाल में जोश और ज़िंदगी में तवानाई वापस आएगी। अगर आपको ये नुस्खे मुफीद लगे हों तो वीडियो को लाइक करें, कमेंट्स में कुदरत का शुक्रिया लिखें और होम लाइफ उर्दू का सब्सक्राइब ज़रूर करें, ताकि आप ऐसे ही मुफीद और कुदरती इलाजों से जुड़े रहें, क्योंकि यहाँ हर बात दिल से कही जाती है और दिल तक पहुँचती है।
They are about to discover that the fat Americans are fresh, full of fight, and piloted by men who have traveled across an ocean just to kill them. Over the Kyushu coast, 26,000 feet, the formation breaks. It is not a panic, it is a calculated explosion of violence. Bogies at 11 o'clock low, drop 'em if you got 'em. The radio command unleashes the 318th Fighter Group. The P-47Ns, now stripped of their external tanks and thousands of pounds lighter, pitch over. This is the bounce. It is the moment of maximum advantage, where altitude is converted into lethal speed. Below them, a squadron of Kawanishi N1K2 Georges and Ki84 Franks are climbing desperately to reach the B-29 bombers. The Japanese pilots see the dive and instinctively brace for a dogfight. They expect the Americans to come down, shed speed, and try to mix it up in a turning battle, a horizontal dance where the nimble Japanese planes hold all the cards. Instead, the Thunderbolt pilots keep the throttles walled. Lieutenant James Red Miller, flying a P-47N nicknamed Big Stick, watches his airspeed indicator wind past 400 miles per hour, then 450, then 500. The airframe grows rigid as the airflow slams against the metal skin like concrete. The control stick feels as if it is set in cement, requiring 2 hands to make fine adjustments. To the Japanese pilots looking up, the attacking P-47s don't look like airplanes anymore. They look like falling anvils. Miller picks his target, a dark green Ki84 Frank, climbing at a steep angle. The Japanese pilot spots Miller and banks hard left, a sharp, tight maneuver designed to force an attacker to overshoot. Miller doesn't take the bait. He doesn't try to turn inside the Frank. He simply rotates the heavy jug slightly, pulls lead, and lets gravity do the work. For a split second, the 2 aircraft intersect in time and space. Miller squeezes the trigger. The P-47 shudders as all 8 M2 Browning machine guns fire simultaneously. This is not the polite tat-tat-tat of wing guns found on early warfighters. This is a barrage of 100 rounds per second, a wall of lead. The stream of incendiary tracers connects with the Ki-84's fuselage. The result is catastrophic. The Japanese plane doesn't just take damage, it is physically disassembled. The heavy caliber rounds smash through the cockpit, the engine block, and the wing roots. The Frank explodes into a cloud of aluminum confetti and burning fuel. Miller flies right through the debris cloud, his radial engine swallowing the smoke. He doesn't stop to admire the kill. He is moving at nearly 550 miles per hour. Now comes the maneuver that breaks the spirit of the enemy. Having slashed through the Japanese formation like a wolf through a flock of sheep, Miller hits the bottom of his dive. He yanks back on the stick. The massive paddle-bladed propeller bites into the thick lower-altitude air, and the P-47 screams. The nose comes up, vertical. The kinetic energy stored in that 7-ton airframe releases. The Thunderbolt rockets upward, trading its massive speed back for altitude. A Japanese pilot in an N1K George tries to follow. He pulls his nose up, firing his cannons, hoping to catch the American climbing. But the laws of physics are cruel. The lightweight Japanese fighter, designed for agility, lacks the momentum. It stalls out, hanging helplessly in the air, its energy spent. Miller, looking back through his bubble canopy, watches the Japanese plane falter. He is already thousands of feet above it, safe, untouchable, and reloading his energy for another pass. He is the cat, the Japanese are the mice. This scene repeats across the sky. The P-47s are slashing, zooming, and slashing again. It is a vertical fight, a yo-yo tactic that renders the Japanese maneuverability irrelevant. The radio chatter is a chaotic symphony of victory. "I got a flamer! Break right, Blue 2, break right! Watch that Zeke on your 6, kick it downstairs!" The Japanese formation loses cohesion. They are scattering, trying to find individual duels, but the Americans refuse to play. Whenever a P-47 gets in trouble, he simply pushes the nose down. The heavy jug accelerates away from danger faster than anything the Japanese can build. It is a slaughter. The sky over Kyushu is streaked with the black smoke of burning aircraft, and almost all of them bear the rising sun insignia. The fat fighters, the ones the Japanese aces had mocked as clumsy, are dictating every second of the engagement. They are proving that in the high-speed arena of 1945, armor, firepower, and dive speed are the new kings of the sky. As the B-29s rumble on toward their targets, untouched, Miller levels off at 25,000 feet. He checks his fuel. He checks his ammo. He takes a deep breath of oxygen. "Flight, reform," comes the call from the squadron leader. "Let's go find some more." They aren't done yet. They aren't done yet. August 1945. The aftermath. The smoke has cleared over Kyushu, but the silence that follows is heavier than the roar of engines. In the final months of the war, the psychological dominance of the P-47N was absolute. The Japanese pilots, once the feared samurais of the Pacific who had terrorized the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, had been reduced to hunted prey. The statistics tell a cold, hard truth. In the span of just a few months of very long-range operations, the P-47N groups claimed staggering kill ratios. The 318th Fighter Group alone was credited with hundreds of aerial victories. But numbers on a page don't capture the visceral shift in the air war. It wasn't just that the P-47N was shooting down Japanese planes, it was how they were doing it. They were beating the Japanese at their own game of intimidation. For years, the Zero pilot relied on the fear that he could outturn anything. The P-47N pilot relied on the certainty that he could outrun, outdive, and outgun anything. The Jug could take punishment that would vaporize a Japanese fighter. Pilots like Gabby Gabreski would return to base with gaping holes in their wings, cylinders blown off their engines, and rudders shredded by flak, and they would land, taxi to the revetment, and walk away. Conversely, a single burst from a Thunderbolt's 850 calibers was often a death sentence for the fragile Japanese airframes. The disparity in survivability broke the morale of the Imperial Army Air Force. Veteran Japanese aces, the few who survived until 1945, wrote in their diaries of the metallic monsters that fell from the sky like lightning. They lamented the loss of the Knight's Duel. They couldn't draw the Americans into the elegant, swirling dogfights of 1942. The Americans fought like engineers. They applied overwhelming force at the point of weakness and then vanished back into the sun. The Ki-84 Frank, which was supposed to be the savior of Japan, became just another victim. It was a brilliant aircraft, fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed. In the hands of a master, it was deadly. But against the P-47N, it was fighting a losing battle against physics and industrial might. The Frank suffered from poor build quality late in the war, unreliable engines, and a lack of high-octane fuel. The P-47N was the peak of American automotive-style mass production, rugged, reliable, and fueled by an endless supply of high-grade gas. As the war drew to a close, the P-47Ns began ranging freely over Japan, strafing airfields, trains, and factories. They became the symbol of total air superiority. The Fat Fighter had become the ultimate predator. When the surrender finally came, the P-47N pilots flew victory rolls over Tokyo. They looked down at the devastated landscape, the burnt-out cities, and the empty airfields. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt in the Pacific is often overshadowed by the P-51 Mustang or the F-4U Corsair. But in those critical final months, during the longest fighter missions ever flown in combat, it was the Jug that held the line. It proved that clumsy is a relative term. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't graceful, it didn't dance. But when the P-47N dropped its nose and roared down from the heavens, it was the undeniable, unstoppable hammer of victory. And for the Japanese pilots who looked up and saw that razor-winged silhouette diving toward them, the mockery died in their throats, replaced by the realization that the age of the samurai was over and the age of the machine had begun.